Yeah, my topic today is the connections between the lively trade between England and the Low Countries in the long 15th century and literature and art. It's a very broad topic, too broad, so I've decided to focus on the merchant adventurers. They provide a very useful focus. It was their business to export homemade woolen cloth to the Low Countries and to import from Brabant and Flanders in particular fine linen and luxury goods that could be purchased in the towns and the markets of Brabant and Flanders. And I think these business activities do shed some interesting light on the literary and visual art of the period. The ordinances of the merchant adventurers of London, which were digested into order by their secretary, John Wheeler, in 1608, show that this fellowship of merchants was organized rather like a guild. To trade in cloth and luxury goods between England and the Low Countries, you had to belong to the guild and you had to pay a fee. Some merchants from outside London didn't like this state of affairs very much, and they petitioned King Henry VII in 1497 to limit the membership fee to 10 marks. But in doing so, they tacitly accepted the trade monopoly of the merchant adventurers. And the petition describes the history of the merchant adventurers in a way that sheds some light on their origins. The fine, imposition and exaction at the beginning, when it was first taken, was demanded by color, by couleur, under the pretense of a fraternity of St. Thomas of Canterbury, at which time the said fine was but the value of half a noble sterling, and so by colour of such feigned holiness it had to be suffered to be taken for a few years past, and after it was increased to 100 shillings Flemish. The company thus may have started as a religious confraternity, and this makes sense because this was the normal institutional framework under which aliens are clubbed together in late medieval cities. In the 16th century, the administrative centre of the merchant adventurers became fixed in London. But before that, in medieval times, the headquarters was the Low Countries, first in Bruges, where the English merchants had a house called the Domus Anglorum, the House of the English, and then an Antwerp, which displaced Bruges as the centre of commercial activity for English merchants in the final decades of the 15th century. Now, the person who brings art and trade together most visibly is William Caxton. He was governor of the merchant adventurers in the Low Countries, and he held that post from 1462 to at least 1469. The governor was a kind of chief executive, although he had to deal both with external relations, dealing with the town authorities, negotiating with other merchants, and so on. But he was also in charge of internal affairs of the merchants, and he had to settle disputes between the members and so on. So it was a very, very busy job. When he retired from this job in about 1469, he found plenty of time to write, to print books, first in Flanders, and then later when he returned to England in 1476, printing in Westminster. Now, his collaboration with Flemish printers has been very well examined by Lotte Hellinga and others. His relation to a Dutch printer, Gerard Leeuw, is more mysterious. Gerard Leeuw, for a long time, practiced his trade in Gouda in Holland. And this was not a place where the merchant adventurers usually resorted to. There is, as far as I'm aware, no evidence that Gerard Leeuw, the Dutch printer, and William Caxton, the English printer, ever met. But nevertheless, the connections between the two is really very striking. First, there is the fact that William Caxton translated and printed in 1481 Reynard the Fox, first published by Leeuw, published by Leeuw in 1479. The intriguing thing is that Caxton seems to have had his hands on an earlier edition printed by Leeuw, which simply hasn't survived. In other words, Caxton knew things about Leeuw that we don't. The fact that English readers had access to Leeuw's books is not in itself surprising. Leeuw relocated his business to Antwerp in 1484, and Antwerp was the headquarters of the English nation at that time. And the reason why he relocated was presumably to find a larger international market. He started publishing then in Latin, more than in Dutch. And some of these Latin books are known to have ended up in the hands of English readers. We also know that Gerald Leeuw traded books on the markets of Bergen op Zoom. But it has to be said that all this evidence for Leeuw's wider distribution is late. It dates from after his move to Antwerp in 1484. Caxton had already published his translation of Leeuw 3 years earlier. So what I think is remarkable about Caxton is how early that connection with Leeuw is. And we may well wonder if that connection was a personal one. Did they meet? And certainly Caxton's professional career as merchant and diplomat becomes important there, because Caxton visited the town of Gouda on a number of occasions in 1475, and I have the records here. They have been edited and translated by Klein in the reference that I give you here. The reason he visited is that Gouda was famous for beer, and it was famous for boats. It is on the River IJssel, so it connects both with the North Sea, and it also connected then with the southern Netherlands through that river. And what Caxton needed in 1475 was boats, because Caxton was sent on a mission to requisition boats to ship English soldiers over to the continent as part of an agreement between England and Burgundy and their alliance against the mutual enemy, France. Caxton seems to have visited, the first visit seems to have been very unsuccessful. He went on his own as a factor, as an agent of the King of England, trying to persuade the local shipmen to part with their boats, but this wasn't successful. So he came back with representatives of Burgundy and with representatives of the Council of Holland. So we know that he visited Caxton visited Gouda on at least 3 occasions, and one wonders if this was the occasion on which Caxton also met Gerald Leeuw. That Leeuw and Caxton's paths crossed in Gouda has to remain entirely conjectural. I don't think it's conjectural to say that they struck up some kind of partnership. As intriguing as the connection between Leeuw and Gouda at the start is what happens at the end of Caxton's life. At the end of Caxton, when Caxton died in 1492, Leeuw printed 3 of books that Caxton had earlier printed: Paris and Vienne, The History of Jason, and The Chronicles of England. He also printed another book called Solomon and Markolf, which we have in our exhibition and which has intrigued me greatly. Maybe Leeuw saw an opportunity after Caxton's death to benefit commercially from the death of a rival. That's the way it's usually framed. But there is another alternative possibility, which is very attractive and I think more plausible, and that is that Leeuw was Caxton's business partner, and that actually Caxton himself tasked Leeuw with reprinting his books when he was no longer able to do so. In that list of books, we should now include also Solomon and Markolf, which I'm convinced is a work by Caxton. It is rather obscured in the convenient modern edition of Solomon and Markolf, which prints the English text by Gerald Leeuw in parallel with the Latin text, thereby implying that the English is a translation of the Latin. It is in fact nothing of the sort. Solomon and Markov was translated from Dutch. The earliest Dutch printed edition was printed by von Homberg in 1501, and Caxton must have used, because I think the translator was Caxton, a text rather like it. How do we know that the English Solomon and Markov was translated from Dutch and not from Latin? Well, let's compare the English with the Latin and with the Dutch. So the English Solomon and Markov reads at one point, "We may not all be like," which, where the Latin has "non omnes omnia possunt," which means we cannot all do everything. And the Dutch translates as "wie en mogen al niet evenwel." The English is not translating the Dutch. The English is not translating the Latin at all well. It seems to be a misunderstanding, and I think the misunderstanding is in fact of the Dutch, where al, wie en mogen al, which is everything in Dutch, has been confused with all as the adjective, we may not all, and even, meaning to be equal, has been mistaken by Caxton as we may not all be like. So Caxton has actually been translating the not the Latin, but the Dutch. It becomes very clear if we look at a longer passage here. I have on your left is the English, as printed by Leeuw, and then on the right of the slide you see the Dutch text. And you get remarkable things like words like windbrouwers in the English. The word means eyebrows, but it's borrowed from Dutch, which had the word wijnbrouwen or windbrouwen, which is used at the equivalent point of the Dutch text. There's the strange translation, if that was what it is, of she had a brooch of lead, a span broad, which is not in the Latin at all. But when you look at the Dutch speaks of een broeke, a brooch, oft gespan, or a clasp. And I think the translator misunderstood this as off span and has translated this as off span broad. So there are these relations there between the Dutch and the English, which can really only be explained if we assume that the English goes back to a Dutch text. By the way, the only other author to use windbrouwen, eyebrow, in English, as if it were an English word, is Caxton himself. And I find numerous other words and peculiarities that only occur otherwise in Caxton. So I'd like to announce to you that Solomon and Markov is in fact a work by Caxton. Back to the Merchant Venturers. And another amazing thing, it's the Antwerp window, the English window of the Cathedral of Our Lady. A fascinating stained glass window in Antwerp, which is clearly devoted to English royalty. I have here a picture on it, and you will recognize the Tudor roads very prominently. You may recognize the portcullises. These are all emblems of Henry VII, favored by the Tudors, and you may see the letters H and E. These allow us to identify the king and the queen who are portrayed in the window as Henry VII and his wife, Elizabeth of York. It's tempting to conclude that the window was commissioned by Henry VII himself, and that is what some historians have argued. But a few details are out of place. There is first of all the location. The window is in the chapel now, in the chapel of St. Anthony of Padua, but this chapel was historically the Jerusalem chapel, or the Circumcision chapel. It was called the Circumcision chapel because this chapel hosted one of the precious relics of Antwerp Cathedral, a little bit of the foreskin of our Lord Jesus Christ. First mentioned as belonging to the cathedral in the 14th century, this relic was carried every year in solemn procession through the city of Antwerp. And that procession ended with offerings being made in the circumcision chapel. We find wonderful descriptions of the procession in this book, the Antwerpse Ommegangen. The procession was held, as we know from these descriptions, in den Zinksenmarkt op een zondag, on the Sunday of the Whitsun market. It involved the craft guilds, the archery guilds, the religious orders, but it was above all a civic occasion. And this was true for the chapel too, which became known as the Magistraatskapel, the chapel of the city government. The merchant venturers held their own procession to mark the beginning of the Zinksen market, by way of calling God's blessing on the business that was about to take place. And a petition contains, from the reign of Elizabeth I, contains a potted history of this religious observance. Noblemen and magistrates did at the beginning of any Zinksen marts come to Antwerp to see the fellowship pass before their first show day, from the English house there unto the church being the Cathedral of Our Lady, to hear divine service, being at the least 12 or 16 aldermen of sundry cities and towns of the said realm, all clothed in scarlet. We don't know which chapel, unfortunately it's not said which chapel the divine service was said, but it would be very apt if it had been the magistrate's chapel. Certainly that's the obvious location. The civic context of the chapel fits in with another detail of the window. If you look on the left and the right of this slide, you see a coat of arms that has nothing to do with the royalty. It is the coat of arms of the merchant adventurers who, I think, commissioned the window. And associating themselves with Henry VII was prudent, because Henry actually harbored suspicions about the loyalty of his subjects in the Low Countries. The merchant adventurers had been great supporters of Henry's rival, Edward IV. Margaret of York, the Duchess of Burgundy, was a continual thorn in Henry's side, and the English nation was suspected of siding with these rebels, maybe for good reasons, because we know that Perkin Warbeck, one of those Flemish rebels, stayed in the merchant adventurer's house in Antwerp, according to Jean Molinet's Chronique. He held state in the hostel of the English, and there he had his arms displayed outside. So what the merchant adventurers did was to support, at least outwardly support, Henry VII. There are some poems in this window, and I thank Maureen for helping me with this poem. One complication is the historical layering. The inscription on your right carries the date 1879, when the window was restored. But the poem on the left is much earlier. I have it here for you here, the text for you here. And the reason we know it's earlier is that in 1613, Pierre-François Sweert published an inventory of monuments, and he recorded this inscription, which he jotted down. He jotted down this poem, which he had seen, he said, in a fenestra vitrea, in a stained glass window. Let me read the poem. Henry VII, the prudent and kind king of the English, received his realm by virtue of war. Having defeated the cruel tyrant in battle, the noble Briton joined both houses in marriage. Elizabeth was his wife and of royal descent. Was his wife, I need to draw your attention to that. The pious daughter of the noble king, etc. Tudor propaganda. When was the window made? Well, we have some help from the Antwerp Cathedral accounts, which read as follows: for the year 1503, given to the workmen who put in the barring in the chapel of Jerusalem, since they worked after hours, and payment to the workmen of the glazier as their bonus. 1503. The occasion? Probably that the year before that, in 1502, Henry and Maximilian's plenipotentiaries signed a renewal and confirmation of the intercourses, the trade agreement which they'd signed in 1496, and this was ratified and confirmed in Antwerp. And I believe, as following Anne Sutton, that this was the occasion when the window was made. So a window made in 1502, installed in 1503. But what about this strange line in the poem? This was Elizabeth. Elizabeth was his wife. This must allude to the fact that by this stage he died. And I think the 1537 accounts actually gloss this. And the following can be found in the 1537 accounts. At the same time, advanced and paid out by Peter Pickard for the reproduction of the changes to the English window, 20 stivers, to the clerk of Master Cornelis Butt for writing out the same aforementioned memorial, 18 groot Vlaams. Changes made to the window in 1537, and I think the poem probably dates from that point. And we now know it's the author of this fine poem, the clerk of the Master of Cornelis Butt. Finally, I would like to draw your attention to the artist. It must remain, we don't know, he's not named, but he did a very good job incorporating Henry's likeness into the window. It's been completely ignored by art historians who've written a great deal about the portraits of Henry VIII. He seemed to have had a standard portrait, which he circulated, and image and paintings were made after him. And this seems, in fact, to be the earliest representation of Henry VII. If you compare it with other portraits, this one made by a Netherlandish artist in 1505, a slightly later one here, you'll realize what a good likeness this is. The gaunt face, the long straggly hair, the rather thin lips. It really is Henry VIII himself, Henry VII himself. Come on to Henry VIII. I cannot determine who the artist was, only that he painted Henry VII very well. And so many questions remain. But I'll just conclude by saying that history repeated itself and that Henry VIII followed in his father's footsteps. In 1514, he commissioned from the glazier of Antwerp. Was he referring to the same man here that made his father's window, a stained glass window of himself, to fill the great east window of St. Nicholas Church in Calais, as we know from these records, paid to the glazier of Antwerp for glazing of the great east window, and paid to a painter of Ghent for taking of the portraits of the king's visage to be set in the said window. We have what appears here the first recorded usage of the English word portrait. And it's not surprising it comes from English documents written in Flanders, which is where you went to have a good portrait made. It is also where Henry VII and Henry VIII went to get glaziers. But that is another story that is altogether better known, the story of the window in Antwerp Cathedral. Thank you very much.